Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Witchy. I'm the president and CEO here at the Damien Center. Thanks for joining us. Today, my special guest is Dr. Carrie Foote, and thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you today.
It's great to be here.
So for those of you those out there that might not be familiar with you, tell us just a little bit about yourself and what do you do for a living?
Sure. Well, my name is Carrie Foote, and I am a professor at IUPUI here in Indianapolis. I'm in the Department of Sociology. I'm also a woman living with HIV. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1988, contracted HIV from injection drug use. So I've been living with HIV for over 30 years now, so a really, really long time. So one thing I'm doing here in Indianapolis that's related to my professor work, but also here in the community that affects people that you serve here at the Damien Center, is I'm the chair of the HIV Modernization Movement, Indiana.
Yeah, and so that is a really exciting movement. It really does try to, as you said, modernize some legislation that was written many years ago. So what is the focus of that committee? How do they, or group, how do they focus their work in trying to change things today?
Sure. So we're not an organization. We're just a network of people. We are statewide throughout the state of Indiana. We were formed by people living with HIV, so myself and some peers living with HIV, as well as some allies working in the HIV arena who are not living with HIV but providing direct services to people living with HIV. And in 2016, we learned about several laws, unjust criminal laws, some of them that are linked to public health laws, that basically unjustly criminalize people living with HIV in our state, that are just grossly outdated, not based on current science of living with HIV. So we saw this need to do something, that people in Indiana needed to be educated about, where we've come since I've been diagnosed in the 80s when it was a death sentence.
Yeah, because a lot of these laws were written in the 80s originally, right?
Yeah, so our very first laws were written actually the year I was diagnosed, which is 1988, and then after that, every couple of years, another law came along, and then another law came along.
And we should maybe take people back to that time, because it was a really different time than today. There was a lot, people didn't know a lot, and there was a lot of fear and a lot of misunderstanding. What is your memories of that time period?
It was absolutely terrifying. So, when I was diagnosed, I essentially thought, okay, you've got a few years to live. Fortunately, I was young, so I think I didn't quite understand what that meant as somebody who was 18 years old. So I was just focused on my struggle with substance abuse and addiction, and just really trying to deal with that, rather than focus on this life-threatening, diagnosis that I got at the time. And fortunately, I lived long enough to benefit from modern-day treatments, which came out in the mid-90s. And since then, it's just been like, wow, this has become a chronic manageable condition. People living with HIV can live just as long as everyone else, as long as they get into care, they have access to care. But one thing that really hasn't changed, like we have the treatment, we have the prevention around HIV to really turn the tide on this epidemic. But one thing that really has persisted since the 80s is stigma. So we have this horrible epidemic of stigma that started in the 1980s and continues today. And one way that stigma manifests itself is in our laws. So we've actually structurally implemented stigmatizing people living with HIV by criminalizing them in our laws. So for example, I, as a person living with HIV, could face a felony conviction, which is very serious and can wreak havoc on people's lives. If I'm even just accused of not disclosing my HIV status to a potential sex partner, and in Indiana, a needle sharing partner. So if I still injected drugs and I didn't disclose my status, I could potentially face felony convictions. It doesn't matter whether HIV could even be transmitted. So, for example, I'm undetectable. I cannot transmit HIV. This is part of the latest science, that when we treat people, not only do we live well and we thrive, but we now know that treatment is prevention. That if I have condomless sex while undetectable and you cannot find my virus in my blood, I cannot pass on HIV. Yet I could be criminalized in Indiana for things like alleged non-disclosure to a sexual partner. We also have other laws around bodily fluids. So any of my bodily fluids in Indiana are considered potentially a serious weapon. So if I spit on somebody, I could be charged with a felony, even though spit doesn't transmit.
Right, doesn't even transmit the virus in any way.
No, and it's not a very nice thing to do.
Yeah.
Anybody could be charged with a misdemeanor crime for spitting in an aggressive way. But as people living with HIV, we face sentence enhancement precisely because of our disease status. And that there's no reason for that because spit does not transmit HIV. So
now,
that's
do
one
we
thing we're trying to do is modernize these
So
laws.
have anyone been unjustly, kind of faced the consequences of these laws that you're aware of in recent years, right?
So unfortunately, we have had a lot of people charged under these laws, and we have several laws in Indiana that unjustly criminalize people living with HIV. And we have had people both charged, and we've had people serve time under these laws.
It's crazy.
And often in cases where there's no even possibility of transmitting HIV. And outside of the actual charges and people doing time, we have had throughout the state of Indiana, a lot of these laws have been linked to our public health laws. So even folks who don't press charges, who don't face charges, face the consequences and the negative consequences of these laws when they receive services. For example, at many HIV service organizations or when you go in to receive HIV care, often people living with HIV are reminded of these laws that, oh, by the way, you're HIV positive. Do you know that it's the law that you must disclose your HIV status? You cannot donate blood products. Otherwise, you could face felony convictions. So right there, from the time we test positive in the state of Indiana, we become potential criminals. Even if we never may break those laws or be accused of it, the fact that the law is there tells us, wait a minute, you just told me I could live well, I can do anything that anyone else can do, that my HIV status won't hold me back. But yet, then you tell me that there are these laws that can potentially criminalize me just because I'm HIV positive. And one thing folks don't often understand is that when you engage in a crime, the first thing someone asks is, did you intend to harm somebody? So what was the intent going on? And then was harm even possible? And then did harm actually occur? And with our particular laws, that aspect of a criminal law is missing. It doesn't matter what the intent was. I could be terrified. Receiving an HIV diagnosis, it's scary. A lot of people don't know about the major, developments and, what it's like to live with HIV today when you have treatment. And there's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of discrimination. So they're scared sometimes to tell people. Sometimes they do tell people, but it's in the privacy of intimate relations and there's no documentation. And then somebody gets angry and they use the laws against them to retaliate against them. Some people face severe harm, particularly women can face abuse from male partners who are abusive to them when they disclose their HIV status. So they don't intend to harm anybody. And then often no harm is possible, if I'm on treatment. And I can't transmit. There's no possibility of
Let's
harm.
talk about that, because that's you mentioned that earlier about untransmittable and U equals U. So the U equals U movement is that undetectable equals untransmittable. And in today's world, if you're taking your medications and you're virally suppressed, you cannot pass the virus on. But you can still go to jail for having unprotected sex that would not pass on the virus, right?
And in that, what advocates, what we try to explain there is that the laws, regardless of the science, the laws themselves are problematic. Because it doesn't matter whether or not we're undetectable on whether we can be charged under these laws. And what matters when there's a crime is the intent to harm. And whether harm actually occurs, and then what is the nature of that harm? And what should the punishment be? And often we see overly harsh punishments with these laws. And we don't want to see like what we call a viral divide in the law.
Right.
We don't want to say, well, those folks like myself,
Right.
who happens to be very privileged, I
Right.
have private insurance,
Right.
I'm white,
Right.
I'm educated,
Right.
I have access to healthcare, I have access to understanding very easily how to navigate healthcare systems and navigate all these forms that
Right.
people throw at me and that sort of thing. A lot of people living with HIV are very vulnerable populations
Right.
who experience racism, homophobia, transphobia,
Right.
stigma against people who inject drugs, and they don't have these same privileges that I have when they try to access systems of care.
Yeah.
So we do have people who aren't able to reach undetectable for a wide variety of reasons that are beyond their control.
Right.
And then they face these laws
Right.
that could potentially criminalize them at the same time. So what we're trying to do with the modernization movement is to modernize the laws to not only reflect current science, like
Right.
don't have a law that criminalizes you for spitting.
Right.
When spitting doesn't transmit HIV.
Right.
Just get rid of the sentence enhancement
Yes.
and treat us like everybody else.
Right.
And then also to modernize the law so that if you are going to have a criminal law that brings anybody's disease status into that law, it should be based on best criminal justice practices.
That makes sense.
So what is the intent in someone's mind? Did
Right.
they intend to harm another human being?
Right.
Was harm even possible?
Right.
And then did any harm occur?
Right.
And so that's one aspect of modernization, is to say, well, you could have a law based on like any bodily harm law, right? Somebody stabs somebody, they cause harm.
Right.
If I intentionally try to pass on a virus, and I do that, and then some degree of harm has occurred, they live with a virus now that we don't have a cure, we don't have a vaccine. Yes, it's highly manageable and we can thrive and live well.
Right.
And, you know, we can have relationships, have babies, we can do all, you know, anything anyone else can do. But that was, we intended to harm and we harmed. You can have a law, but right now the law doesn't do any of those sorts of things. You can also get rid of the HIV laws and just charge people under general criminal laws for those sorts of things.
For those same things.
And there's pluses and minuses to each different strategy, you know, to doing that.
So you've, as part of this process, you've had to go to the state legislature and you've had to testify and talk about it.
Yes.
What's that been like?
So that's been an incredible process. We have a wonderful champion in the legislature, Representative Edward Clare, who is just incredible when it comes to his understanding and compassion for people living with HIV and having sound policies and laws that are really embedded in best public health practices, who has led a few bills around HIV modernization. And really done an amazing job working with advocates, people in the community like the Damien Center, to try to modernize these laws and to educate our you know, assembly and our state legislatures, you know, on just basic HIV 101. Where are we today?
Right.
You know, look at, you know, the advances we've made, and now we need your help to modernize these laws so we can eliminate stigma in the laws, eliminate unjust criminalization. You know, we know, working in this field, that criminalization is never a solution to a public health problem.
That's right. Never.
Right.
Never.
So if we can modernize these laws and base them on best public health practices, everybody benefits in Indiana, because we'll eliminate stigma. More people will come in to get tested. People who are living with HIV will be engaged in care. The more that we eliminate the stigma and kind of normalize this, like any other illness that people might be diagnosed with, that has to be managed. So we've had a couple of bills over the last 2 sessions, and this most recent session we had some success. And the success, it's small, but it's huge. What we did was we eliminated stigmatizing language throughout our public health code that is linked to the criminal code. So just one example there, one of our criminal codes was called a duty to warn law. So I, as a person living with HIV under Indiana, had a duty to warn, that actual wording. Warn, danger.
Warn, danger, red lights flashing.
Red lights. That's very scary. I'm a very scary person. to warn somebody of my HIV status prior to engaging in any kind of act that could potentially transmit HIV. So rather than really, the law itself is problematic, but rather than go at it to just do our full modernization effort, we said, you know what, let's just address this language because the words we use matter.
Right.
And we just did a simple thing, change the word warn to inform.
Right.
And you can just see, now I have a duty to inform,
Right.
which doesn't have that loaded negative connotation.
Right.
Actually is easier because it makes me feel less like I'm this horrible person, with a scarlet letter where I'm danger. And we modernized several words that were stigmatizing. Yeah. The word carrier, we were referred to as carriers. We changed that to just an individual, person first language, individual living with a communicable disease.
So, I mean, it's sort of a step in the right direction. It doesn't solve some of the main legal issues that you described earlier where people can get prosecuted, but it's a step along the way to get things in a better place. And so do you view this kind of as a multi-year process to get us as a state to where we need to be? Because there are other states that have already modernized their laws, right? I mean, we're a little bit behind, right?
Well, I would say we're actually doing quite good.
Good.
And the reason for that is modernization with these HIV criminal laws. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Right.
It's going to be a multi-year effort. And it's almost, sometimes a lot of folks don't understand, to change any law, no matter how simple the law.
It's complicated.
It's complicated. It's a process. And we realize that in Indiana, that this is going to take a while. We need to first educate our legislators. We need to educate folks in the community. And just about basic HIV 101.
Yes.
Let's just get everybody on board. Where are we today? This is not the 80s. And then from there, oh, by the way, let's look at these laws. Let's look at our public health policies linked to the laws. So we've been kind of doing different from some of the other states, kind of a piecemeal approach, because we have several laws in Indiana that need to be modernized. And we have criminal laws and public health laws. Some of them are linked together.
Right.
And we're starting with the public health side because that's our real expertise in the HIV arena is public health.
Makes sense.
Starting there to work with those and then work with the criminal laws that are linked to our public health laws and then just educating.
Yeah.
So each session we go further in terms of educating our legislators, educating the public, educating the HIV arena and folks who work there. Yeah. And we're making incredible progress. And I think one of the strengths is that we are going slow. Yeah. We are realizing, this is going to take time. Yeah. And we've changed a lot, I think, since we formed the HIV Modernization Movement in 2016. We've changed a lot of hearts and minds in the community. Yeah, right. So we're seeing less charges. Yeah, that's good. We're seeing more understanding, more compassion, more of a public health approach on the ground. Good. And because of that, less implementation of the law. And that's a wonderful thing.
That is great. That's progress. Yes. Sometimes the progress isn't just changing the laws, but changing people's philosophies and attitudes, and that has to be a process too. Yeah. Now, if there are people watching this and they want to get involved, how can they get involved? Like, how can they keep updated? You kind of have ways for people to keep updated on what's happening, ways that they can get involved in contacting their elected officials. What do they need to know? Right.
So the main way to get involved is we are on social media. We do have a Facebook group. So if anybody's on Facebook, they can like our page and follow posts there.
And what's the name of that page for anyone who's listening?
HMM Indiana.
Okay.
And it's very easy to find. Good. And then we do have a website.
Good.
The HIV Modernization Movement .org, and that one is spelled out. Okay. HIVModernization.movement.org. And then on that website, there's a link called How to Help. And if you click on that link, there's an option to sign up for our email listserv. And that's what I recommend is the best way to follow our work. Yes. Because the listserv is where we share anything related to what's going on with HIV modernization in our state. This is a national movement and actually a global movement around the world to end the unjust criminalization of people living with HIV. So lots of opportunities. to get educated, lots of opportunities for people living with HIV to get involved and to become their own advocates and to find their own voice, to share their stories.
Right.
That's one huge way to bust stigma.
It
Just
is.
share your story, put a face to this, let people know what we look like. We look like your brother, your sister, your partner, your child, your parent. We're you. Anyone could be living with HIV. And then when they follow our listserv, anytime we do have legislation and we have something that's going to be voted on in the State House, that's when you can call and we can educate you. How do you call your own senators, your own representatives, and let them know your thoughts about HIV and modernization and where you feel you want to vote on this particular bill? And so the best way, join our listserv. You can also just email me, Foote with an E, F-O-O-T-E at iupui.edu, and I can add you to the listserv as a simple way to do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I get the listserv. It's really nice. I mean, you really do a great job of keeping everyone updated, and it's really easy. So if there is something where people can get involved in, it's really simple and explains what you need to do. So kudos for that. And I want to make sure that I also celebrate you for a minute because last week we had the Damien Center Grand Masquerade, and we recognized you there for the efforts that you do in this modernization movement. And we've gotten tremendous feedback I have from people saying like, oh, I'm so glad that you guys are focusing on this and looking at this issue of the modernization again and drawing people's attention to it. So I think what I just heard over and over again was how appreciative people were of the work that you do and celebrating all the amazing attention you've brought to this issue and helping people to live less stigmatized lives. So I really am impressed by the work you do. So I want to thank you, and I'm so glad that you were able to come by today and talk with me.
Well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful. Anytime I get to talk about HIV modernization, I'm here.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, we'll have you back again. And maybe when we get into a legislative session and you're hot and heavy and doing some of that work, we'll have you come back and talk to us a little bit more about it. That sounds great.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great day.